Yeah, so John, it seems pretty intuitive to me that they're two different things. So would you like to establish your position to let me know where you're coming from?
Yeah, I guess I could try to break down essentially how I see it. As this may be a learning experience for me, I don't have much education in the field of biology and stuff like that. But based on my basic understanding of things, the process of being alive or existing is starting from developing either in an egg or in an embryo, depending on what type of. We'll just use humans for an example. Starting in the womb is two cells with half of a genetic code combining to create a single cell organism with one full genetic code, and then that cell replicating itself until it's a multi-celled organism until it's developing like a fetus, blah blah blah, till it's born, and then it's an existing creature that interacts with its environment and slowly grows and ages and develops, and eventually, say in the scenario, it doesn't succumb to any tragedy or you know anything like that. It eventually, the structure of it breaks down to the point where it can't contain, whatever the word is, it can't perpetuate the life any further, and it dies, and the life ends. So that's the process of living, or being alive, as far as I understand it. But that seems to narrate the process of dying to me at the same time. Like, from the very second that the cell is a single celled organism, it's slowly replicating itself, perpetually towards its decay. So, like, even though, like, the gradient, you could say, in a perfectly hypothetical scenario, the human being doesn't succumb to any tragedy or kill itself, and it simply exists until it decays to the point where it dies. Well, that entire life is a slow decay process to the death. So, whereas we can use life and death to indicate, various concepts or aspects of the timeline, they're essentially describing the same process.
Right, okay, interesting. Well, the immediate criticism I would have of that view would be the evidence for new cells, right? So we can evidence new cells forming. So it's not just like you're born with X amount of cells, like let's say like a trillion cells, and then those trillion cells like slowly decay over time until they just like break and then you die. That's not really what seems to happen, right? So your body's creating new cells all the time, um like your skin sort of like slowly sort of like sheds cells and new cells grow, and if you cut yourself, then your wound will heal with new cells. And there's always new cells and regeneration going on. And not only just partly, but to such a large extent that within, I don't know the exact time frame, you can get any sort of number on this, but some people say 7 years or however many years, all of the cells in your body have regenerated. And I thought that yeah, there's some sort of argument to be had that certain cells in the brain don't regenerate and you are born with a set amount of cells. But I'm not really sure about that, and I don't really know if that is um a complete fact that is indisputable. I think for the most part, most parts of your body not only regenerate but completely replace itself with new cells. It's like Theseus's ship. So it's like with after a decade or at least a couple of decades, you're no longer physically the same person, like in terms of just your molecular makeup, your the matter which comprises your body. If you're a materialist, let's just presuppose materialism for this debate because it will be awkward otherwise. But the matter which comprises your body um, is just new matter. um, as opposed to how it was previously. So there's actually no reason why we couldn't discover new means or discover what was going wrong in the regeneration process and just be like, oh, well, actually, we can just tweak these things, or we can just eat this specific compound, which has this epigenetic effect, and we could just keep regenerating, right? In the same way that if you cut something, your skin will heal, and you might have a scar or something, but you can still heal and have healthy skin. And so we could just like heal perpetually, and there's no reason. Like most people die because of heart disease and cancer, and the top 10 killers are all things which are pretty much linked, apart from like suicide and getting hit by a bus and stuff. The most frequent causes of death, I think the top 14, excluding suicide and accidents, um, are preventable lifestyle diseases, which if you were to eat a healthy plant-based diet, you just wouldn't die from these things. But most people are dying left, right, and center from heart disease and all these things when you can reverse these things on a plant-based diet. And I'm sure you're on board with that type of information. So I think given a plant-based diet, maybe some additional tweaking with epigenetic research and some additional insight, I don't think there's any reason why we all die. Like, there's no reason for us to die.
Well, I appreciate the points you brought up. I'm going to try to address them as best I can. Um, so you mentioned the new cells in the body. The way I would see that to oppose my argument, I would only see it actually oppose my argument if, like, every time your cells went through mitosis or you regenerate an aspect of. I think the two aspects are. Let me see if I can bring this up. It was like meiosis and mitosis, and meiosis is like what creates egg and sperm cells, and mitosis is like the fundamental process for life, where cells duplicate each other to create identical cells or whatever. So like the only reason that wouldn't be a process of death is if when that occurred, the new cells were stronger and healthier. And the only way or the only time period that's apparent is when you're developing from a child until your full development as an adult. And then from that point on, you don't develop any further. You just age to your decay. And why I see that as an entire death process is because just like any other chemical process, like say if I were to watch a flame, like an ignition in slow motion, um, just like the process of life, there's a small reaction at first. You can see like an initial ignition or whatever. It spreads rapidly to a massive degree where like the flame ignites the whole chemical and it's super bright and kaboom, like a big, stronger than it was when it initially ignited. Just like when you're born as a baby and then you develop to your complete complex adulthood, you go through this rapid chemical process to reach your peak. And then just like the ignition of the flame in the chemical process, you just decay. And that whole process is the part of life as well as death. And no human being, regardless of their dietary choice or their lifestyle habits, can escape this decay. No sentient life can escape this decay. Plant matter decays, sentient animals decay, human beings decay, and you can, even though the cells are developing and getting stronger from your birth to your adulthood, um, that's just the initial influx of the chemical process, but it all leads to the initial or the inevitable decay. So at the beginning of your life, you're mitosising your cells all the way to the point of your death as that process decays over time.
Right. Well, I've got a few objections to that. So I'm gonna object on two levels to the proposition. One level, or like there's two different types of um, approach I'm going to take more. It's more accurate to say that way. Two different types. So one type of approach I'm going to take is to argue from a biological point of view, and I'm going to do that now and address your what you've just said just there. And the other point, I'm going to talk more of a philosophical perspective, which we haven't discussed yet. So right now we're still on the biology, but I just want to close that chapter off and then get into the philosophy
Sure.
side in a sec. So the so some of the points you just said, you made an analogy to a match, for example. So when the match is ignited, there's this big flare up, and then it dies down, and um, then after the wood is consumed, it goes out and dies. Um, I think this paints a picture which supports the analogy or the analogous nature of what you wanted to depict with that. But it seems inaccurate to me because a match has got a type of like almost like an explosive compound at the end that is dipped in, and then so obviously that will flare up, and after that's extinguished, then the wood, that's only just to set off the wood burning, and then when the wood um, has consumed all of the um, or all of it's been converted to carbon or whatever happens there, then there's no more fuel and then it goes out. But if we just talk about flames in general, if you light a gas flame, as long as you're providing it with gas fuel, it'll just stay alight indefinitely. Like you, if there's fuel, it will stay alight. If you increase the fuel, it will get bigger. So you could even make gas flame increase over time. So you could start off very small, like a little pilot light in a boiler, for example, and then increase to some huge inferno after 1,000 years, providing that you've provided it with enough gas. And the I'm not just trying to point out um I'm not just trying to like object to the analogy by just coming up with a gas flame analogy instead of a match, but it's because it's analogous to some creatures which are actually found in the world that we live in. So we have like some species of jellyfish, um, which I don't know if I even want to bother to try and pronounce, uh, but I'm just going to call them TD jellyfish or immortal jellyfish. And they've been observed to be essentially immortal, like the name would suggest. They just don't die out unless you come up to it and like squish it or something, then it's going to die. But in terms of its biological process, it just that theoretically it can just live indefinitely. There's no reason why it needs to die. It's just it will just regenerate and go on. And so we do actually have examples of life forms which have no reason to die. Like so not only is that a biological counterexample um to your claim, but I feel like humans, we die because of um there's some undiscovered uh well, there's a lot to be discovered in the aging process. And I think the more we discover, the more we know, like we can stimulate cell growth with IGF-1, certain hormones. We can stimulate, we can turn off and turn on certain genes that have to do with aging. And there's certain uh, aging pathways that we've found out about. And I think I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it isn't like Tor. There's like something to do with Tor. I can't remember what it is exactly, but there's certain pathways which are being discovered right now that, especially that Italian dude, Professor Longo, I think his name is off the top of my head. He's researching all of this, and that's what a lot of the blue zone research was. And I think I when our understanding of the medical science is more complete, then it might just be a case whereby humans could be like the immortal jellyfish. Like we take certain hormones, take certain things, we eat certain compounds from foods that just inhibit the aging process and inhibit free radical damage and DNA damage and these undesirable processes, and there's just no reason that we die unless we're like slain or hit by a bus, right? So, what do you think about that then?
Well, I don't know much about that that you know the stuff that they're researching in terms of making humans immortal. I did look up the immortal jellyfish, though. It's very interesting read. This creature, apparently, if it takes like damage or is in a life-threatening state, like it's starving or something, it can regress back into a polyp, and then a new jellyfish is born from that. It eventually buds and releases um, medusae. I don't know how to put it, medusae or something that are genetically identical. But this doesn't indicate that it's the same exact. It's like essentially the jellyfish turning into a cocoon and then new jellyfish being born from the genetic material. It's not indicating that it's the same jellyfish surviving death forever. Also, what there was another point you made that I wanted to address. Oh yeah, we were talking about the gaslight or the using the so that and this is kind of a philosophical aspect of it. Like life is, as far as I understand it, cannot exist without death. Um, Sentient species need to consume material in order to exist. So I mean, you can go all the way down to like the creatures that eat like fungus or plant matter to to the carnivorous or hunting creatures that eat those creatures or whatever. There's always a consumption process for energy. You need a constant source of energy to perpetuate your mitosis, which is like your cellular division or whatever. So death is required in that process. So if everything were to be immortal, where would we how would we perpetuate that required energy for life, especially if we're creating new life through breeding? And at the same time, uh, it, just like the match flame analogy, there's that initial bright ignition because it's the fresh life, having that fresh energy slowly decaying over time as the energy is being spent. And the process of utilizing that energy is decaying because as the cells divide, their ability to function slowly decays over time. That's why you have old age and eventually people die from old age, is because their structure breaks down because at the very cellular structure, the cells dividing are weakening each time. And that's the whole process of life. That's part of being alive, is your cells dividing to your death. So to me, that's the process of death as well.
Right. So, a couple of points there. I think we're almost in a position where we can start to close off the biological aspects and go into a philosophical side of the conversation because I think all of the biological arguments are pretty much on the table now. We've got the jellyfish, we've got cell division and entropy, and the biological sort of that's all been presented, I guess. My counter arguments to that, the only counter argument I'm going to have, which is biological, is going to be the fact that we can simply use hormones like IGF-1 to stimulate cell growth, right? So we can modulate cell growth so that we can actually have stronger cells um, after division takes place. It's not just like a it's not just I'm not even sure what it means for a cell to be weaker than another cell. If you just mean like there's um there's like cell division and there's some sort of entropy in the system as a whole. Um, yeah, that's fine, but I'm not sure what it is about like if you take like a skin cell, like what is weaker about a new skin cell than the previous skin cell. I'm not really sure about that. I think we can just modulate. If that is the case, we could just modulate the that with IGF-1 because IGF-1 like encourages cell growth, right? So Um, or do you have like specific evidence to point to regenerated cells being somehow um, quote unquote weaker? What does that mean? Is that like functionally they don't perform their function as well, or what do you mean by weaker cells?
Yeah, well, I don't have much information on the biology, but just this is coming from simple observation that uh, most, if not all, sentient life succumbs to old age. Um, you know,
Right, but that's just like more like
there's a clear decay in quality over time as the cells continue the mitosis process,
sure, but this isn't like the cells themselves. This is just like entropy of the structure of the system as a whole,
which is made up of
right?
all
I
the
don't think.
cells.
Yeah, but I mean, it's like the orchestra of the cells and not the individual violin player, right?
Yeah, but the orchestra gets worse if like the violin strings start breaking and aging. So it's all in relation to each other.
Yeah, what I'm asking you though is if you have any evidence of violin strings breaking, aka like the
Yeah,
cells actually physically being weaker.
yeah, people decaying to old age and succumbing to death by old age, like organ failure and things like that.
Yeah, but is that the individual cells or is that the ensemble of the cells?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure to which degree, like what, everything decays at its own rate or process. So, like in some individuals, maybe the liver cells decayed faster in their mitosis process, and that's why they succumb to liver failure, or someone succumbed to pancreatic failure or heart failure, whatever is classifiable as, death in natural causes or old age. The different processes of life. The point is that all cells decay in quality over time relatively to when they were first initiated at birth, and that's apparent based on death by old age.
Right, but I find like there's a confusion between two things that I'm saying. So on one hand we have cells, and on the other hand we have an organism or organ comprised of cells. So it's very uncontroversial that we would have an organ which is weakened because of the structure or because of damage of the um I don't know, the way that the cells are working in that organ. But then it's a different claim to say that the cells themselves are weakened. And I'm unsure if it's actually biologically correct to say that there's such thing as a strong or weak cell. Maybe that is the case, but I'm just not sure about that. I've never heard of an individual cell being weak.
Well, that's fair. Well, without getting too into the terminology, my point is still, or my proposition is still supported if I just adjust the language in this manner. What I don't have much education on the different aspects of the biology, but whatever process, like how organs function in the human body, is based on, obviously their cellular makeup, as well as how the cells interact with each other, and because everything in the body works in unison, and it works based on like electrical impulses and stuff like that. That, right, because we have a nervous system, and everything's all hooked up and it all works in unison, and that's why things function properly, blah blah blah. And that's why when there's an issue, and something happens irregularly, things could occur, failures, or you got to go to emergency. So whatever is occurring there, whether it's the ability of the cells to communicate with each other, it's the overall quality of the cellular structure, or how successful the mitosis is, whatever aspect of it is, it gradually decays in quality over time. And that's why people die of old age. That's why nobody's immortal. And we brought up immortality earlier. That's interesting to me, but I don't know how far we could actually go into immortality. But as far as I understand the natural process of life, um, life is death in the sense that things decay over time.
Yeah, I just wanna address the biological point that I feel was still on the table before moving into the philosophical objections with the proposition and with what you've raised. The only remaining quibble I have is um, this idea that cells always get weaker over time, and there's no way that we could modulate that through some means to not be the case. First of all, I'm not even convinced that cells do get weaker over time. Um, I'm
Well,
convinced that there's entropy in the entire organism, right? So the way
I
that the cells interact, right, and the whole organism not working in the best way, and the organism starting to break down and stuff like this. But I'm
right.
not. Mm,
I don't mean to cut you off, but I just felt like I clarified that by saying I don't know too much about the specific details, but whatever aspect of the process is decaying, it's clear that there is an overall decay over time, whether it's the cellular structure or the way the cells communicate or what. So I'm not necessarily claiming there's strong cells and weak cells. Just I just want to clarify that.
sure, that's fine, but it's sort of important for my distinction because if we can regenerate cells, for example, we use stem cells or some sort of regenerative technology, which is um, not, it doesn't even have to be uh, modern medicine, right? We could discover some plant compound which boosts stem cell creation, and then the stem cells could somehow like regenerate the parts of the body which are needed by the body to like rejuvenize certain organs, and you could potentially live a lot longer, if not indefinitely, right? So I think there's no reason why we ought to die hard coded into our body. It's just sort of our telomeres sort of have a certain length, and then they get shorter over time. But if we could like lengthen the telomeres and we could rejuvenate with stem cells, and we found some sort of medicinal compound which people in ancient times knew about, but was then lost, like the sort of elixir of life, which was actually a thing, which was just a plant or a fungus or something which we'd previously known about, and it was only certain people had access to it or something, and that's how there were certain tales of old where people lived for um, hundreds of years. Maybe we could find this thing. I'm not saying that it's realistic or anything. I'm just saying that it's not logically, that there's no logical contradiction to suppose that this thing exists, right? So, in terms of biology, I don't think there's an open and shut case to say that um, we are we are necessarily doomed, or life is necessarily has to end um, in some sort of like process of death intrinsic to the life, right? Because if you get killed, that's not like an intrinsic part of the life. That's just like being slain or something, right? So the immortal jellyfish is like um that's one example, but you've raised the example that it's you've raised the objection that it's not the same jellyfish, it's just genetically similar. So then all of these um all of the following things, or everything that we'll have to go into now, is just going to be philosophical. I think we've now gone through all of the biological considerations, um, and unless you want to raise an objection to what I said about that, doesn't seem to be a logical contradiction in saying that life doesn't have to terminate in an automatic um, degeneration to death, then we should move on to the philosophical points now.
Yeah, that's fine. I think immortality is a good aspect to discuss. You mentioned our method of achieving immortality would be through scientific intervention, like understanding how our cells function when they mitosis, recognizing whatever the decay process is, or how how it actually works biologically, and then combating it by whatever, editing our genes, or creating some super drug that revitalizes our cells every time they divide, or but you're prolonging the process. Like your cells, you're not stopping your cells from dying, you're not stopping the body from doing the process of mitosis. You're doing the same thing that you do when you eat food or drink water. You're sustaining your inevitable death. So even though you're immortal, it's only due to the interventions that you're doing, and as soon as those interventions are not apparent, you know the process continues on as it's supposed to.
Alright, okay, cool. Well, I feel like we should go into the more philosophical objections then. So the what what I feel like is on the table now is we need to tidy up the difference between um death being required for life and death entailing uh life entailing death and life being the same process as death, because they're three different claims. You said earlier with um you raised this objection earlier that even if we could be immortal, we still had to kill to survive because we would have to eat plant matter and that's death. I feel like that isn't what the proposition is entailing. So I'd like to take that off of the table that just because death may be a requirement of life, the proposition it has more to do with death being the same thing as life,
Well, no,
the
I
same
I,
process.
I specifically said that you have to maintain whatever intervention that is, just the same way that you would eat food or drink water to sustain your life naturally. If you're doing some immortal process, you're doing it through scientific intervention or whatever. You would have to maintain that intervention because you're not changing the actual process. Like the cells will still, seek to divide through mitosis, and the body will still do what the body was doing already before your intervention. That's
Sure,
what I was saying.
sure, but this was I was addressing a point that we said about 10 minutes ago. You raised an objection that even if we could be immortal, we still need to eat plant matter, and at some scale, some time, there's death involved in the process. So I just wanted to take off the table that um, if death is in the process, some or like if it's required somehow, that's not the same thing as it being the same process, right?
Oh no, I mean, I say life is death and death is life because the process of life, like I said in the opening statement, is like from birth to peak development to decay to old age. You're going through a process of burning energy and cell division to the point where you're decayed. If you look at the process of dying slowly over time, it's the same thing. It's the exact same process. Like your cells are dividing to the inevitable point where you have organ failure or whatever, and you die. So the process of being alive to me is the same as the process of dying. So that's why I say that.
Right, but the process of a leaf dying, which I eat, hasn't got anything to do with me dying, right?
No, I mean the only way those two things are related is that the same thing that the leaf is going through to cause its decay is the same thing that you're going through essentially.
Right, but just because leaves die and trees and plants die and insects die on the plants and stuff like this, um, just because I eat that food, that's not related to the proposition, is it?
I don't know if I claim that it is, but sure.
Yeah, sure. Because that was one of the things I just wanted to get off the table because I felt like that might have been put on the table at some point. So I'm glad, yeah, we could take that off the table. So
Um,
now the next thing would be to understand whether there's a difference between death being required for life versus or death being at the end of life and death and life being the same process.
yeah, we can get into that, but I just wanted to clarify the only thing I recall about bringing up consuming, besides that initial recall I gave you, the only other thing I can recall when it came to consuming plants is like I was saying that the process of life requires energy and requires constant consumption of energy or whatever. So whatever
Yeah.
your food source is, I think that's the only thing I was trying to refer to.
Yeah, I felt like that was linking in because your food source requires energy, or you require energy, your food sources have to die in some way. So I thought that you were linking that into the process, and I thought that that was maybe confusing to the proposition. So I
Oh
just
no,
wanted to
I
get that
just
off the
meant
table.
it needed a constant like fuel source or whatever. Like
Right, yeah. Okay, so yeah, so that's not on the table. The I, I want to get through this distinction between death being at the end of the process of life and death and life being the same process. Do you think there's any meaningful difference there?
well, I mean, Wait, meaningful difference between the two things you just said.
Yeah.
What was the first thing you said?
So we have death being so we've got two things. We've got life and then we've got death. Or we've got one thing, one process, and life and death are the same process. And I feel there's a meaningful difference between saying there's two processes, life and death, and there's one process, which is life and death of the same thing.
I That's fair. The way I see it is language. The goal of language is communication. So while the process could be seen as the same process, you would want various methods to explaining different aspects of the process. Like if you're trying to refer to timeline or something like that, or you know what I'm talking about, like the initial, you would talk about things related to life or whatever. And if you want to talk about the end of the timeline, language is just for communication, but the actual process that the language is describing is the same process. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right. I've I've still got a bit of an issue there because I can use language to represent these two contrasting accounts, right? I can say that at the end of life is death, but I can also say that no, actually, life and death are the same process because death starts when you're born and it's just a very slow process. And so the whole time you're alive, you're actually dying. So life and death are the same thing. And um, yeah, right. So you've got this life and death intertwined idea, and then you've got this idea of, oh, I'm alive, and then I die at some point, and then I'm dead. Right. So then there's a contrast between life and death actually being the same thing, or life being a process and then death being the process which happens after life.
Yeah, what you said just sounds time relative. Like, oh, I'm alive, and then, oh, I'm dead. You're just saying this part of the timeline, that part of the timeline. But when you're saying life is death, you're describing the whole process of that timeline.
I feel like saying um, process of the timeline is simply referring to the life, what I would call the life cycle, right? Whereas life seems to indicate to me the part that we're alive, and then death is the part that we're not. But the life cycle, or life and death, are a subset of the life cycle. But life is not death, right? But you could make the claim, which I thought the proposition was trying to argue, that because entropy might start at the point of conception or something, like there's some sort of, every time a cell divides, there's like some movement towards death or something, that actually the whole time that we're alive, we're actually dying. So dying happens the whole time we're alive. Even when we're a kid, we're dying slowly. I
That's what
thought
I'm
that was,
saying.
yeah, that's the point that you were trying to make at the start.
Right.
That seems to be a separate point than to say that simply you live your whole life. Whilst you're alive, and then after you die, then you're dead. That seems to be
I
something
didn't say
altogether
that.
different.
I didn't say that second one. I said
Sure, that's what I'm trying to differentiate between the two, and then once we commit to one, I'm then we can proceed with the conversation. So what you're saying
what
is you don't think
where
that we're
did the,
alive.
where did the second one come from? That's what I'm confused about.
Well, the second one of we're alive and then we die and then we're dead, so they're two different things. That's just the common sense understanding. That's how everyone thinks of it, right? But your understanding is the somewhat more fringe understanding of being alive is actually dying,
Oh, I see what
right?
you're referencing the common understand. Okay, I see what you're doing. Okay, I was just confused. As maybe you were saying I said that at some point or something like that.
No, I'm just trying to differentiate, especially for the audience as well, trying to distinguish between the two so that we have a very clear conception of what we're talking about and so that we can hone in on that particular thing. So we're talking about when you're alive, you're actually dying, right? I'm dying right now, you're dying right now, a baby is dying right now, but very slowly until we finally reach death, right? That's what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm essentially saying we're slowly going through the process that leads to our death, so we're dying over time.
Yeah, like right now I'm slowly dying is what you're
Uh,
saying, yeah.
Essentially, yeah, it's all time relative.
Right. So what I would say, I've got two objections, two lines of reasoning that I would go down to. critique that view. Um, the first one is going to be discussing. Well, let's go for the second one because the second one is quite easy to do and it will be a lot quicker. The second one is basically bundle theory. Are you familiar with Hume's bundle theory?
Unfortunately, no. Sorry.
Right. So you
I'll
know
Google
David
it
Hume,
while you're
famous
talking.
philosopher, right?
I've heard that name, but
Sure. He's a philosophical gangster, and he was um, the the main influence that quote unquote awakened Kant from his dogmatic slumber. So he was a really important figure in Enlightenment philosophy. And one of the things that he said was that identity is just like a box of stuff. If you actually say, "Who are you?" you're going to say, "Oh, well, I'm someone called Footsoldier. I like cycling. Um, my favorite color is green, or maybe it's pink. I haven't decided."
they're
And
constructed ego essentially.
yeah, it's just a bunch of things. And you can ask their name. Their name is just a property of like stuff in a box. And if you think about all of the properties of someone, that is their identity. And to say that there's their identity or their existence or them as a being, them as a person, them as a human, or them as a soul, or whatever you want to imagine they are in essence, to say that there's some essence there which is transcendent of just the properties alone, you'd have to be able to imagine them without any properties. And you can't imagine something without properties. You can't imagine an apple without being green or without being round or without being a certain weight or without having a certain taste or a certain smell or a certain anything. You can't imagine a propertyless apple or a propertyless human. It doesn't make sense. It just seems to be um incoherent, right? So if we think of life or someone's identity or the jellyfish, the eternal jellyfish, if we think of the eternal jellyfish as being one given jellyfish and then it regenerates and you're saying, oh, well, this is a new jellyfish now. It's not the same jellyfish. Well, what was it that was the difference there? What was it that was the previous jellyfish and now isn't the new jellyfish? Is it because it changed shape? Or if I changed shape, would I not be Foot Soldier anymore if I was like talking to you all in the same way? What was it? Is it because um it is older now? Well, am I different if I age? Well, if identity is just a bunch of properties, then we've got a problem with identity if we because we're changing our properties over time. I'm I'm growing, maybe I'm developing new tastes, new preferences, new habits, new ways of speaking, new understandings. I'm changing over time. So is my identity changing over time. So it's very difficult to be able to point to someone and say um, that like either you have to point to someone and say that is me, that is Foot Soldier, and in 10 minutes when I've learnt something new, you point to me and say that's still Foot Soldier, or you have to keep pointing to me every second and say that's a new Foot Soldier, that's a new Foot Soldier, that's a new Foot Soldier, and I'm different all the time. So identity is actually a bit weird. Identity is almost an illusion, right? Identity just relies on an understanding that we give to something, not that the thing has intrinsic to itself. Are you with me so far?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Although I did say, like, to me, based on how I'm understanding the process of that jellyfish, it seems like it could be a new jellyfish based on how I understand consciousness. But even if that's not true, that doesn't really change what I'm specifically saying. Neither does what you're saying. Like, what I'm describing is the actual process, like being alive and then dying. Like, even if we granted a bunch of stuff that we can't prove, like say consciousness is like whatever you are, whatever you learn, whatever exists within your body, that's foot soldier, right? And even though your body's going through the process of life all the way to the point of death and then being dead, and your consciousness leaves, say you reset that process, like someone regenerated the cells in your body, or restarted the whatever is required to bring someone back from the dead, and your consciousness re-enters the body. That's not really, that doesn't adjust what I'm saying is the process in terms of the process. We don't really have to go too deep into what consciousness is to understand what the proposition is. The process of being in existence, being alive, um, is the same process as dying because you're slowly dying over time. You can make attempts to intervene that. You could bring yourself back from the dead. You can sustain yourself and become immortal through intervention, for however long you're applying the intervention, but you're not changing the actual process. Nothing about the actual process is being adjusted. The cells still function the way that they do, and life still perpetuates in the same fashion and order, with things decaying and becoming material for the next aspect of life to gain resources from, to perpetuate their life into decay. The process itself remains the same.
Right. So I feel like the jellyfish example is an important counterexample because I feel like that is an example of something that's immortal and isn't th- death isn't they're not slowly dying because in fact they're just going on living and there's no problem, right? And the issue that you brought up with that is not the fact that they're immortal, but the fact that it's a new jellyfish. And I think bundle theory refutes that because to say that it's a new jellyfish is to say that I am a different person than when we started this conversation or when I started this sentence, right? So you wouldn't say that I am a different person since the start of this sentence, but you are saying that the jellyfish is a new jellyfish. But what are you going to point to in virtue of it being a new jellyfish?
No, I'm saying it doesn't have to be a new jellyfish. The process is still the process, whether it's a new jellyfish or not.
But it doesn't die.
I don't understand what you mean. Why, when you say it doesn't die, I mean, it no longer exists the way that it did. It has to regress back to the point where a new jellyfish is born from its uh, biomaterial. Like, it eventually becomes like an embryo carcass that a new jellyfish is birthed from. So whether it's the same consciousness from the old jellyfish's carcass in the new jellyfish, the process is still the same.
Well, look, I lose skin cells. Like if um I cut my hair off, my hair falls off all the time. Snakes shed their skin. Um, Cats molt their fur. Just because we jettison cells as part of life, it doesn't mean that I'm new every day because, or when I go for a haircut, I'm a new person. Or you could say that that person's a new person when they've had a haircut, but then we're getting into the territory of I'm a new person since I started this sentence.
It I'm trying to say we don't have to go too deep into consciousness. It doesn't matter if you're a new person or not. That doesn't change the process of life and death.
Right. So you're saying that um like I'm dying because I have a haircut.
What? No, I'm dying. I'm saying you're dying because over time, as your cells are going through the function of mitosis, the overall process is decaying to the point of failure where you will succumb. If you live a perfect life of no accidents, you'll succumb to old age and die. And even in the case of this immortal jellyfish that is seemingly immortal because it keeps regressing into a a larval stage or a cocoon stage where another jellyfish is born from it. Polyp or polyp, or I think is what it was called. Um, Polyp. I don't know how to pronounce it. Um, we can't observably know if that's in like perpetually forever, as long as time goes on. Like, what if it only occurs up to like 50,000 years or 100,000 years or even just 100 years, whatever. Like, that's not observed, and in the majority of observed life that we understand, there is a decay process to the point of death. So, regardless of how consciousness functions, whether you could perpetuate your consciousness state in existence by, you know, revitalizing your body over and over, or upgrading yourself and putting yourself into an AI robot body or something and just swapping out the parts, like that's not related to what I'm specifically presenting with this proposition. The proposition is that the process that we label as life, being born and developing and going through life, is the same process that we label as death, because we're slowly decaying and dying over that period to the point where we die.
Right. So I think I've put quite a few objections forward. I think now we just need to uh, look at the words themselves, right? Because um, you weren't happy with you didn't feel like my jellyfish bundle theory attack was sufficient somehow. You seem to be begging the question slightly the um with the life is just the process of dying and it's the same thing, because I feel like the counterexample is the jellyfish and the counterexample is um the hormones um which boost cell growth and stem cells which rate regeneration and stuff like this, like but if you're just gonna say now that life and death are somehow related, then and not actually that they're the same process like the proposition um, is stating, then I think we've diverged from the proposition. The understanding that I have of the proposition is that you're trying to say, as I'm living, and even as a child is living, they are dying slowly. They're dying, they're edging ever slowly towards death in an increasing fashion, and they'll die because death will finally, it's like you start off 0% dead on T0, and on T death, you're 100% dead, right? And it's like some sort of progression, linear or not, it's some sort of progression towards the 100% dead, starting from 0% dead. And it's just like ever increasing. But I've given counterexamples of that not being the case. Like, for example, we could rejuvenate using dietary intervention or medical interventions, going from even if you perceive it to be like a countdown or a count up to 100% dead, we could go from 50% dead to 20% dead then, and it seems like it debunks that perspective of looking at the jellyfish certainly does that and avoids going to the 100% dead. But um, if it was just this linear progression, like a child is slowly dying and they're getting more dead as they live, then it would, if it was like some progression towards that, then there would be a decline noticeable from childhood. It would be like we were born, um, and then we just decline from that point onwards. But we can see that we can improve ourselves, get more athletically fit, we can get more mentally developed, even into, I'd say, 40s and 50s, and maybe even some people in their 60s, right? Or even you could get more fit as a 70-year-old, or maybe even an 80-year-old, you could get more fit, right? It just seems to be that there is some point at which people have got so much solar bombardment and genetic damage and stuff that there's entropy and the system breaks down. But I've got no problem with saying that. But entropy isn't death. And excess entropy can lead to death, but entropy itself isn't death, right? So it's problematic the way that you're visualizing this in the sense of the proposition, because I just feel that is very, very clear, and we can get into linguistic basis for that in a minute. But it's very clear that we aren't just slowly dying from children, right? Because we can grow, we can get better, we can get stronger, we can get fitter, we can get smarter, right? At pretty much any age, providing that we're healthy. And so that just seems to be an intuitive rebuttal, and I've given you specific rebuttals with the jellyfish, with the stem cells, with bundle theory, with the objections of there being a new jellyfish, and I feel like if you disagree there, then it's just going to have to be a disagreement.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, what we'll do is I'll just and you can address this if you'd like, but I'll just make this as my final response and closing statement. But I feel like that I've addressed the rebuttals or the points that you've brought up. My just to reiterate, because I just want to be clear for the sake of communication, because I can recognize, and if this is the case, I apologize, but I can recognize that my use of the language can be confusing, and I can be misinterpreted in what I'm trying to present. But what I'm trying to say is that the process that we can label as life, the process that we recognize to be the natural process of life, being born, developing into a peak development, and then slowly decaying from that peak development to a point of failure, is what we recognize to be the process of life, is also describing the process of death because you're slowly decaying to that point of failure. And the point you're bringing up about the child and growing and then humans, getting athletic and growing, everything is time relative. And I brought up the chemical process of like there's that initial burst of energy to the point of decay. And the same way in life, there's that initial development to the point of peak development. What is it, like 20 something years? Like a super healthy human can live to 100 plus years, right? So 20 something years is just a fraction of that. It's like a fourth of that. But if we're talking about what you're talking about, where we're applying intervention, and this is why the immortality points and the points about adjusting how our cells function, being healthy and stuff, doesn't change what I'm saying, is because it's time relative and it requires an input. Even if we increased our ability to be super healthy for hundreds of years, like the process of our life is just expanding over time. It's still the same process. We're slowly going to decay over time. Instead of it being 100 years now, it's 300 years. In the process of being immortal, that immortality requires an input. There's no way that you're changing the way that your cells function in your body to the point where they're perpetually healthy and they never divide and replicate. Like, I don't know of any scientific whatever the word is, organization that's doing stuff like that. But if you were even able to find some way to become immortal by perpetually revitalizing your health, or you know regressing yourself to a childlike age, you're just intervening in your timeline with input, and as soon as that input ends, the timeline perpetuates as it was. So whatever's creating your immortality has a finite it doesn't change the process. So it doesn't change me recognizing the process of life being the same as the process of death, whether there's intervention, regression to um, an earlier developmental stage or whatever. The process itself is still the same. Nothing about the actual process has changed. And I don't see any reason to see them as two separate processes. I recognize the value in using separate words for the sake of communication, um, but I don't see any reason to see them as two separate processes.
Okay, cool. Well, I know you said that was a closing statement. I had a final pathway that I would like to discuss with you, and it was the linguistic component of it. Um, and I don't know, would you like to discuss that, or shall I make this a closing statement?
Uh, yeah, go ahead. Let's see what you got to say.
Yeah, because we've talked about all the biological stuff. We've talked about the jellyfish and the bundle theory and stuff like this. But now I see what you're saying. You're just saying that it just is definitionally the case that because um, death is at the end of life, it's one process. So uh, even if you could make yourself immortal, you're just prolonging your life. But actually, eventually you'll die. So you're just temporally modulating the aspect, and you're not circumventing it, right? So it seems like you're just defining it as such in that case. So none of the earlier objections seem to get round that because I thought earlier it was more of a biological thing, but now it seems to be just an analytic thing, right? So it seems that there's this analyticity going on in terms of the um, language that you're using or the concept that you're using. So I would attack it from a different angle. So I'd say then you can you can point to things which are alive, but you can't point to life, right? So life is an observation which doesn't have an ontology unto itself. So life is not like a certain arrangement of molecules. It's something we recognize. Life is a part of our understanding in that sense, right? So it's not that we can point to life. We recognize something as being alive and having a life, and our understanding shows us that things are alive or things are not alive, and we have juxtaposing terms for that, life and death. So, going off of our understanding and knowing that there's no ontology of life or ontology of death, it's just simply a recognition. It's not a material difference that we can point at, even in a certain way, because then you would have to say the point at which someone dies and spell out the molecular changes or something in that process, which I'm not sure we can do um, so quickly because someone can die and then you can bring them back to life, and that happens routinely with resuscitation and these um, types of things. So it's more like it's an understanding that we have. So we say our understanding is, oh, this person's alive. John is alive. And if John wasn't alive, we would say John isn't alive or John is dead. And to say that John isn't alive is synonymous with John is dead. And to say that John is not dead is synonymous with John is alive. So to say that life and death are the same process or they denote the same thing, then we're just going to run into a logical contradiction of life is um, like someone is and is not alive, right? Or someone is and is not dead simultaneously.
Well,
Um, and that's problematic, right? Unless you're going to point to something true of the world, the ontology of life, which I don't think you're going to be able to do.
Well, see, that's why I say earlier that language, the goal of language is just communication, and you want someone to understand what you're saying. That you use language in order to accomplish that. So we have various words to describe the timeline. Like, so I can point to someone and say, "You're alive." That's to indicate that you're not dead. So you're in the process of death, as to where you're still moving towards the inevitable death. You see what I'm saying? So it's like it doesn't have to change the understanding that they're the same process. It just changes what aspect of the process you're communicating.
Right.
And when I'm saying it's not just a language thing, because like I just googled the process of life, and it's like the basic processes of life are like organization, metabolism, responsiveness, movements, reproduction, basic stuff like that. Well, if I can argue that those are the processes of life, well, if those processes inevitably lead to death, then they're the processes of death too.
No, they're not the processes of death
Why wouldn't they be?
because respiration isn't a process of death.
If it leads to inevitable death, why wouldn't it be?
Well, it's like saying I don't know. I could just come out with an analogy on the spot, but we could say that the London Road leads from London, leads from London to Essex. So London is Essex. No, it doesn't follow.
Um, I don't know if that's the same thing. Because life and death, what I'm describing is the process of existing. What you're describing is like two separate cities that function the same way. A city, like they're both the same thing, but in separate locations.
Well,
So they're just
if
labeled different.
respiration and growth and reproduction and movement and these types of things are the processes of life, but they're not observable in death, then they can't be the processes of death. And to say that they lead to the processes, but they lead to death or something, so they're the same process.
What do you mean they're not observable in the process of death, or they're not observable in death? What do you mean by that?
Well, if you observe something that's dead, it's not going to be respiring, right, or reproducing in a hurry.
Well, right, because that's where the process leads to, is the point where it's not occurring anymore. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but you wouldn't say that reproduction leads to death or respiration leads to death. When I breathe, I'm not dying by
I,
breathing. I'm actually,
I
it's the opposite is true.
Well, no, I can't argue that because the cells break down over time. You're reproducing in order to perpetuate your species, but the species that's reproducing, the creatures are dying over time as they're reproducing. That's why they're reproducing in order to perpetuate their species because they can't perpetuate their own life. So reproduction is required to perpetuate the species because that's how the process of death works. You can't perpetuate your own life, so the only thing you can do is pass down your genetics to a new life as you die. So the process of creating that new life as you die is the process of life and the process of death.
I just have a problem with that. It just seems weird to say that the observable processes of life, let's say that we've got like 7 criteria for the observable processes of life, like respiration, stuff like this, which we can observe when an organism is living. But then when it's dead, we don't observe these things. But the process of life is also the same process of death. It just seems contradictory, right?
But
Just
you can look at it like this, like the process of life has to begin somewhere, right? So like if we're looking at respiratory or whatever, you're saying you can observe respiration in living organisms, but their very first breath had to start at some point, right? So a process is just describing the entire timeline. So the beginning of the process would be the first breath, and the end of the process would be the final breath. So that would be the gradient of the one process, life and death. You see what I'm saying?
well, look, uh, I don't agree because it's sort of like you just contradicted yourself there because we're saying that the process of life is starting with the first breath. It doesn't have to start with the first breath. It could just be the start with respiration. You don't need to breathe to respire. You can respire
Well,
through
no,
other
but
things.
you know what I mean. I'm just
Yeah.
referencing the timeline. It doesn't necessarily have to start with respiration. I'm just saying
Well, no.
the
Let's just say it
timeline
does
has to
start
start
with.
somewhere.
Let's say just say metaphorically that it starts with the first breath and ends with the last breath. Then you've just defined the boundaries of life, and we're saying that what is beyond that is not life, and that is now death, right? So you've just defined that life and death are different processes, um,
No, I
right?
don't.
Because we could even say that there's different processes of death, right? We could say that the processes of death are um, turning into soil, right? So the process of life isn't turning into soil. I don't turn into soil randomly just on a Tuesday afternoon. I turn into soil though after I've died. If I'm
No,
left
see,
outside, I decompose and turn into soil.
that's timeline semantics. I'm saying the process of life start if we're accepting this hypothetical that you just presented about the breath ending and starting or whatever. The process of life starts with the first breath and ends at the first breath. The process of death starts at the first breath and ends at the first or at the final breath or whatever. It's the same process. It's in the gradient you're talking about, like, oh, on Tuesday I'm dirt, but on Wednesday I'm what? That's you're just jumping through the timeline of the whole process.
I feel like the timeline of the process is a bit of a conflation with a separate thing which we call the cycle of life. So the cycle of life is not life. It's not the process of life. It's not the it's not life. Death is not life, right? Death is part of like some sort of like cycle, um, right? Of we can come up with some like idea of a cycle of life, but that is something distinct from the debate proposition.
I'm not sure what you're saying exactly.
So we can have in a Lion King sense the cycle of life. Um, and that could be something which includes varying different processes such as life and death, right? Or you could even insert other processes in there. You could say that the cycle of life includes reproduction and it includes birth and it includes this or that. And death is one of the things that the cycle of life includes. So this umbrella term for what happens um, in sort of like the cycle of life. But when we're talking about life and death being the same process as the debate proposition l- um, is clear in depicting, that is something altogether different. And I feel like if you're just conceptualizing some cycle of life, then you might as well just concede the debate proposition and reword the debate proposition to for another day as the cycle of life includes death. And then I would disagree with that though. But that is not the debate proposition. That is something different. At this
Uh,
point, I feel like we are either close to a debate proposition, you're close to conceding my position in the debate, or we're just going to disagree on this point.
yeah, I really don't understand that. Like, that just sounds like you're using a different word than process. The cycle of life would be the process of life. Like, it seems the same to me. It doesn't seem like it's a whole different category that I'm attaching other things to, and I should be discussing a different thing. I think
No,
it's very
sure.
clear what I'm talking about.
No, it's. I'll try and depict it in set theory. I could draw like a. I could actually draw some sort of de depiction of this. Maybe I could, don't know if I could do like a Venn diagram or something. No, it would be like, yeah, in sets. So let's say we have a set called the cycle of life or the circle of life or whatever you wanna, let's call it the circle of life in some sort of like Lion King way. And within the set of the circle of life, there is birth, life, um, um, death, reproduction. So we can just grant for now these four processes within the circle of life set. But within that set, life and death are two separate things. And within the set of life, there's respiration, etc., the seven signs of life. And then within the set of death, there's turning to soil and other things, being a host for maggots and other type things, right? So in this set theory sort of understanding, um, the circle of life is not the same thing as death or life. The circle of life contains life and life and death are two discrete, separate processes.
But
But
see,
what the
based on what I've presented here, I don't see that. Even if you're saying like there's this one term that's describing both things, but both things are separate. Based on what I'm presenting about how mitosis leads to inevitable decay and moving into the, I don't understand how I can't see them as the same process. I don't see why I'm have to see them as two separate things. They both lead to the same result and they both start at the same point.
there's a conflation between two separate ideas happening here. So I could even formalize it for you if you want, but I think we can just go through it um, in natural language. So concept one, there is a set called the circle of life, and within that set, there are two processes or more processes, including life and death, which are distinct processes. Conceptualization two, which is more in line with the debate proposition, or this is what the debate proposition says to me. Life and death are the same process because once you're living, you're actually also dying as the same process. The two processes are intertwined and not separatable. They're not separable. So, yeah. So to just to reiterate, we've got conceptualization A. Within the set of the circle of life, we have life and death, and they're separate. Conceptualization B. Life and death are the same process because when you're living, you're actually also dying.
Yeah, it's all time relative, and I don't see how the first set makes the things two different categories without using time relative language.
Um, sure, you can have an atemporal understanding just by using the processes. So it's like, is this thing alive, or is it respiring? Is it moving? These sorts of things. Oh, it's respiring, so it's alive. And we look at something else. Is it respiring? No, it's not. Is it moving? No, it's not. Is it turning into soil? Yes, it is. So then it's dead. There's no temporal necessitation in that, and time is only part of our understanding, our intuition as
No,
people. Time
see,
isn't something we can point to in the real world. You can't point to time.
but see what I'm saying is the observations you're making, like, oh, is it breathing? Is it turning into soil? Like, you're making an observation at one aspect of the timeline. You're not making an observation of the entire process. You're not saying, oh, this is creature is going through the process of life, or oh, this creature is going through the process of death. You're describing a time relative aspect of that process which is labeled both as life and death.
Right. So what you're doing there is not saying that the conceptualization A within the sets that I said. You're not saying that that's making a mistake of temporal fallacy or something. What you're doing is just rejecting that. You're saying that no, that's nonsense. That doesn't work because they're the same process, right? And I'm offering you this counterexample of viewing it um, in the in the way of these sets, um, but you haven't really you're just begging the question to why that counterexample is invalid. All you're saying is,
Uh,
"Oh, that's because, they're actually the same process," and you're just pointing to different parts of the process. But I'm saying, "No, they're different processes. I've separated them out into sets, and what's wrong with that?" And you're saying, "Oh, well, they're different parts of the same process," and you're pointing to different times. Well, I'm saying, "No, they're not the same process," and I've demonstrated why they're not the same process. They're separate processes within a category of within the set of the circle of life. And you're saying, "Well, no, you're making a mistake because they're different times in the same process." And then so
yeah,
we're just going to go back and say, "No, they're separate processes, and it's not a temporal element." So we're just going backwards and forth in a circle. Um, at this point because there's these two conflicting understandings, and I'm rejecting your understanding and you're rejecting my understanding. So I think unless you concede that my understanding is valid and you're begging the question by the temporal objection, unless you concede that and then you concede to my position in the debate, then we're going to have to put it to votes at that point because I think we're pretty much at the point where we should wrap it up now. Then,
all right, then yeah, I'll make an actual closing statement this time.
okay,
Uh,
come on.
yeah, so it just feels like maybe you're not understanding what I'm specifically trying to represent. I'm not saying, I'm not just rejecting whatever you're describing as a set because uh, I'm not really even understanding why you're saying I'm rejecting it. I don't see any valid reasons as to why you're proving it to be a set. You're saying it's a set because they're two separate things, and then the example you provided to show that it's two separate things is you said, based on observation, is this thing respirating? No, yes. Is this thing turning into dirt? No, yes. That's how I can indicate that it's two separate things in a separate whatever in your own set. The reason why I'm recognizing that it's the same thing and what you're doing is time relative is because you're describing or observing an aspect of the one process. Uh, Being alive and breathing is part of the process of life because as you're developing from birth to your inevitable death, respiration is a part of that. You require energy in order for your cells to replicate. Why it's a part of death is because you're slowly dying and uh, you intaking energy to perpetuate your life to that inevitable death while you're respirating. So respiration is an aspect of life and an aspect of death. They're the same process. It's just time relative. The language is just used for communication. And I don't really know how else I could reiterate that. So hopefully it's understood. If it's not, I can reflect and see how else I can present it. But I just don't see why I can't see it that way based on my understanding. and I don't really see why your set is proven based on the example you provided. That's basically all I have to say.
Okay, nice one. So I guess my closing statement before it goes to votes would be I put forth two conceptualizations. The first is a set of two discrete things, and the second is the same it's the same thing. And the one that the debate proposition is addressing is life and death being the same thing. And I've offered in this conversation various counter arguments for it being the same thing in favor of accepting the conceptualization that is two discrete things. So the counterexamples, some of them that I've given have been resuscitation. Someone can die and be brought back to life. So that's a clear counterexample. We can get fitter uh, as mature adults. Um, in terms of fitness, in terms of strength. We can gain muscle. We can get smarter by learning more. Stem cells can regenerate. We can regenerate through various different pathways. So these are all clear counterexamples to the um, deterioration, the inevitable deterioration to death. I gave the counterexample of the jellyfish, and I feel like I protected that example using Humean bundle theory. And I think all of these counterexamples really do lead us to think that life and death are two distinct, different things within a set which we could call the circle of life. I think I've made a clear case for that, and yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed the debate.